Hold still, it's just wine, it will wash out.
Oh my God, get this, get this.
Hold still. It's just wine, it will wash out. That is not what she said. That is what he said, smiling, while the crystal glass tipped a second time, and the deep red spread across the front of Danielle's ivory dress, like something opening, instead of spilling. Preston Calloway shrugged at the small crowd gathered near the dessert table and laughed the laugh he used when he wanted a room to laugh with him instead of at him. Regina Calloway, his mother, dabbed her own mouth with a napkin and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Simone Vaughn lifted her phone, angled it, and caught the whole thing, the wine, the silence, the small tight smile Danielle wore instead of tears. Danielle did not know yet that in 19 days she would walk onto a stage 2 floors above that same hotel, and the room would rise to its feet for her. Welcome to today's story. If you have ever been the quiet one in a room that decided your worth before you ever opened your mouth, tap that like button right now, because Danielle is about to teach that entire family a lesson none of them saw coming. And if you want to be here the next time someone underestimated finally gets the room to stand up, hit subscribe before the story moves any further, because the vault only gets deeper from here. To understand why Danielle stood so still while wine soaked through silk, it helps to understand who she had been before anyone at that party ever met her. 10 years earlier, long before Preston Calloway existed in her life at all, Danielle had spent her early 20s working as a financial analyst for a boutique firm downtown, the kind of job that taught a person to read a balance sheet the way other people read faces, quickly, quietly, and without letting the numbers know they had been caught lying. She left that career at 27, not because she failed at it, but because her grandmother's health began to decline, and someone in the family needed to step back from a demanding job to manage what everyone assumed at the time was a modest inheritance and a small collection of sentimental keepsakes. She met Preston 8 months after her grandmother passed, at a fundraiser she had only attended because a former colleague asked her to fill an empty seat at a table. He was charming in the specific way ambitious men are charming when they have not yet been tested by real difficulty, quick with a compliment, generous with his attention in public, and entirely unaware that the quiet woman across the table had spent years evaluating men exactly like him for a living and had simply chosen, for reasons she herself did not fully understand until years later, to let herself believe he might be different. For the first 2 years of the marriage, he mostly was. It was only after his father's sudden passing left him running Calloway Luxury Realty earlier than anyone expected that the cracks began to show. First as small irritations, then as absences, then as a growing need to be seen succeeding by people whose opinions mattered to him far more than his wife's ever had. Danielle watched the transformation happen slowly enough that she kept finding reasons to excuse it: grief, pressure, his mother's expectations, until one day she looked up and realized she had spent 6 years quietly shrinking herself to fit inside a marriage that had never once made room for the person she actually was. She had never told Preston about the analyst job, not out of shame but because early in the marriage, the one time she mentioned it in detail over dinner, he had responded by changing the subject to a listing he was excited about, and something in that moment had taught her, correctly or not, that this was not a man interested in the fullness of who she had been before him. So she folded that version of herself away carefully, the same way she had folded away her grandmother's true worth, not because either secret shamed her, but because she had learned that some truths are safer kept until the room finally deserves them. The party had been planned for months. Regina Calloway's 62nd birthday, hosted at the Calloway family estate in a tent large enough to seat 200 guests, string lights threaded through the oak trees, a jazz trio near the bar, and enough white hydrangeas to fill a small greenhouse. Preston had insisted on the tent, the trio, the flowers, everything visible, everything photographable. He ran Calloway Luxury Realty, a firm his father had built, and he had inherited more than earned, and lately every event he touched had the same brittle shine, expensive on the surface and thin underneath. Danielle had arranged the flowers herself after the florist ran 2 hours behind. She always ended up finishing what other people started and never finishing. Danielle had spent that morning exactly the way she spent most mornings that year, awake before Preston, moving quietly through the kitchen so as not to wake him, answering emails from her grandmother's estate office before he ever came downstairs to ask what was for breakfast, as though the question required an answer from her specifically. She had learned, over 6 years, that mornings were the one part of the day that still belonged entirely to her, and she guarded them the way other people guard a locked drawer. Not because there was anything dramatic hidden inside, simply because everyone deserves one part of their day that nobody else gets to rearrange. She wore navy that afternoon, not ivory, a detail worth remembering because Regina had specifically told her the week before that ivory would upstage the birthday woman, so Danielle had chosen the navy dress without complaint, the way she chose most things in that family, quietly and without complaint. Her only piece of jewelry was a thin gold band on her right hand, worn smooth at the edges, plain enough that no one at that party had ever asked about it twice. She had inherited it from her grandmother, along with several other things nobody in the Calloway family had ever bothered to ask about, including her actual last name before marriage, her education, and the fact that for 4 years before she met Preston, she had worked as a private financial analyst for a firm none of them would have recognized, because none of them had ever asked what she did before she became simply his wife. Guests had begun arriving by 6, filing through the estate's front gate in small clusters. Business partners from the firm, longtime neighbors, 2 of Regina's closest friends from the country club who had known Danielle for 6 years and still, that evening, asked her which catering company she worked for. Danielle answered the question the same way she always did, with a small, patient smile and a correction offered so gently that most people never noticed they had been corrected at all. She had learned that patience cost her very little and revealed a great deal about the people who required it. A cousin of Preston's named Terrence, one of the few Calloways who had ever treated Danielle with anything close to genuine warmth, found her near the gift table and asked how she had been, really, not the version of the question people asked while already walking away. Danielle considered the honest answer for a moment before giving him the safer one, tired but fine, and Terrence studied her face a beat longer than the question required before letting it go, the way people do when they suspect there is more to a story, but understand it is not theirs to pull loose. Preston arrived to the party 25 minutes late with Simone beside him, introduced to guests that evening as the firm's new director of client relations, a title that meant nothing and explained everything. Simone wore emerald, the kind of green that photographs beautifully against string lights, and she stood close enough to Preston that 3 separate guests would later describe the 2 of them as a couple without anyone correcting them. Danielle watched from near the gift table, holding a stack of cards she had spent the morning organizing, and felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent years being early for a marriage the other person stopped attending a long time ago. Regina rose to greet Simone with both arms open, the same gesture she had never once offered her own daughter-in-law in 6 years of marriage. "There you are," she said warmly, as if Simone were the one who had married into this family and Danielle were the guest. Preston laughed at something Simone said near his ear and did not look for his wife across the tent, though she was close enough to see the whole exchange clearly, close enough that Regina's warmth toward another woman felt less like an insult and more like an announcement. Dinner stretched through courses that Danielle had helped select, seated near the end of the table while Simone sat close to Preston discussing a listing in terms that made it obvious she understood the business better than most people realized, or wanted people to think she did. Regina praised Simone's dress twice. She praised Simone's instincts for the firm once. She did not speak to Danielle at all until the dessert course, when she asked, in front of 6 guests, whether Danielle had ever considered getting a real job now that the children were older, since idle hands tend to make idle marriages. It was Preston who lifted the wine glass, laughing at his mother's joke a beat too long, gesturing with the glass in a way that looked accidental to everyone who wanted it to look accidental. The first splash caught Danielle's sleeve. She reached for a napkin without a word, and that composure seemed to bother him, the same way calm always bothered men who expected to see it crack. "Come on," he said, loosening his tie, "lighten up, it's a party," and tipped the glass a second time, deliberately now, red wine running down the front of her dress in a long, uneven line, while Simone laughed behind her raised phone, and Regina studied her napkin with great interest and said nothing at all. Danielle did not scream. She did not cry. She looked down at the stain spreading across ivory silk, felt the cold, wet fabric against her skin, and understood with sudden clarity that this was not an accident, not even close. This was a message delivered in front of an audience because a message delivered privately would have required Preston to actually look at her while he said it. She reached for a cloth napkin from the table, pressed it once against the stain, and set it down without dabbing further, because there was nothing left in that dress worth saving, and she suspected, correctly, that there was very little left in that marriage worth saving either. Preston smiled at the small ripple of laughter moving through the nearby tables and said the words that would matter more than he understood in that moment. "Hold still," he said. "It's just wine. It will wash out." Danielle looked at him, and later she would describe that look to her attorney as the exact second she stopped being his wife in every sense that counted. Though the paperwork would take several more weeks to catch up to the decision her body had already made standing there in the tent with wine soaking through silk and 200 guests pretending not to watch. She excused herself and walked toward the main house, past the string lights and the jazz trio, past a cousin who offered a sympathetic wince and nothing else, and stepped into the quiet of the downstairs powder room, where she locked the door and stood in front of the mirror for a long moment before allowing herself to breathe. Her reflection looked composed. Her hands, when she finally looked down at them, were completely steady, which surprised her more than the wine had. She had spent 6 years learning how to stay steady in that family. Tonight, for the first time, the steadiness felt less like survival and more like preparation for something she had not yet named. Her phone buzzed inside her small clutch. One notification, an email from a firm she had not opened correspondence from in nearly 2 years. Subject line reading simply, "Quarterly beneficiary disclosure. Action requested by Friday." Danielle stared at the preview line for a long moment, thumb hovering over the screen, then locked the phone and slid it back into her clutch without opening the message, because whatever waited inside that email was not something she planned to think about while wine dried into the fabric of a ruined dress in a bathroom at her mother-in-law's birthday party. Outside the tent, Simone Vaughn was already uploading the video to a private group chat with a caption meant to be funny among people who did not know Danielle at all, 3 words and a laughing emoji, and within 11 minutes, that same clip had reached the phone of a woman 2 counties away, sitting in a home office, with the lights already low for the evening. A woman named Renata Cole, whose firm had quietly managed the estate and holdings behind Danielle's grandmother's name for 11 years, and who paused the video, zoomed once on the thin gold band on Danielle's right hand, and said out loud to an empty office, "That's her ring." Danielle drove home alone that night, Preston staying behind at his mother's request to help close out the party, though everyone in that tent understood he was staying behind for reasons that had nothing to do with folding chairs. She parked in the driveway of the house Preston liked to call his, the same way he called most things his firm, his name, his mother's approval, and sat in the car for a long moment before going inside, still wearing the ruined dress because changing at the party would have meant asking someone for help, and she had stopped asking that family for help a long time ago. Inside, the house was dark except for the porch light, the same warm yellow bulb Preston insisted on because it photographed well for the real estate listings he occasionally shot from the front steps for his own marketing, a small vanity that told you everything about how he viewed his own home, less a place to live and more a backdrop for a life he wanted other people to envy. Danielle set her clutch on the kitchen counter and finally opened the email she had been avoiding since the powder room. Quarterly beneficiary disclosure. Action requested by Friday. The sender listed simply as Ashgrove Family Office, a name that meant absolutely nothing to anyone at that birthday party, and everything to the woman standing barefoot in a ruined dress in her own dim kitchen. She did not respond to the email that night. Instead, she opened a second folder on her laptop, one Preston had never asked about because he had never once, in 6 years, asked her a single question about her finances, beyond whether she had covered the caterer's deposit for one of his mother's events. Inside that folder were bank alerts, 3 of them from the past 2 weeks, tied to a credit account she did not recognize opening under her own name and social security number. The most recent charge, a designer boutique downtown. Pickup name listed clearly as Simone Vaughn. Danielle read the charge 3 times before the letters stopped rearranging themselves into something she could excuse. The card was in her name. She had never applied for it. She had never received a physical card. She had never authorized a single transaction on it, and yet there it was, sitting cleanly inside a fraud alert email, a $2,000 boutique purchase attached to her own identity, and gifted, apparently, to the woman who had just filmed her husband pouring wine down her dress in front of his mother's birthday guests. She sat at the kitchen island with the laptop open, the ruined dress still clinging to her skin, and did what she had trained herself to do for years before she ever met Preston Calloway, back when her job had been reading financial statements for people who lied about them for a living. She breathed. She waited. She let the anger settle into something colder and more useful before she let herself act on it. Because the version of Danielle that reacted immediately was the version that made mistakes, and she had not survived 6 years in that family by making mistakes in front of an audience. Across town that same evening, though Danielle would not learn the details until much later, Preston sat in his car outside Simone's apartment building for nearly 40 minutes before going inside, scrolling through messages from a vendor threatening to suspend deliveries over an unpaid invoice, then through a voicemail from a regional lender asking pointed questions about the firm's last quarterly projection, questions he did not yet have honest answers for. He had learned, somewhere in the last 2 years, to compartmentalize that particular kind of fear into a small locked room in his chest and simply not open the door until it became unavoidable, a skill that made him excellent at appearing confident in public and increasingly hollow everywhere else. Preston came home near midnight smelling like his mother's expensive scotch and something floral that was not Danielle's perfume. He found her still at the kitchen island, laptop closed now, hands folded, wearing a clean robe over skin that no longer smelled like wine. "You left without saying goodbye," he said, loosening his tie the way he always did when he wanted to look tired instead of guilty. "I said enough," Danielle answered, and something in her voice made him pause halfway through unbuttoning his collar, a stillness he was not used to hearing from her, a stillness that unsettled him far more than tears would have, because tears he knew how to manage, and this quiet was something new. "You're being dramatic," he said, the way he always said it, the phrase functioning less as an accusation and more as a reflex, a word he reached for the way other men reached for an umbrella, automatic, unthinking, always ready. Danielle looked at him for a long moment, taking in the new watch on his wrist that neither of them could technically afford this quarter, the faint trace of lipstick near his collar that was not her shade, the way his eyes kept drifting to his phone even now, mid-conversation, waiting for someone else's name to appear on the screen. "Did you open a credit account in my name?" she asked, and watched his face do the thing faces do when a question lands somewhere true. He recovered quickly, the way men like Preston always recovered quickly, a short laugh, a dismissive wave, probably some online store. Those boutique sites push their card offers on everyone. Don't make this into something it isn't. Danielle did not argue. She had learned a long time ago that arguing with a man who had already decided what the truth would be for him was a waste of breath better spent elsewhere. "Call the bank tomorrow then," she said simply, and walked past him toward the stairs, leaving him standing in the kitchen with his shirt half unbuttoned and an expression that had not yet decided whether to be angry or afraid. Upstairs in the small office that had once been meant for a nursery and had quietly become hers instead over the years, Danielle opened her laptop again and typed a single name into her contacts before pressing call. A name she had not dialed in nearly 2 years, not since the last time her grandmother's estate required her signature on something routine. Renata Cole answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the hour, the voice of a woman who read panic through silence the way other people read headlines. "Are you safe?" Renata asked first, always first, before anything else. "I'm safe," Danielle said. "I'm just finally ready to talk about the trust." Over the next 20 minutes, sitting in the dark with the door closed and Preston's shower running down the hall, Danielle told Renata everything. The wine, the phone recording, the credit account, the boutique charge, and Renata listened without interrupting, the way good attorneys learn to listen, gathering facts instead of feelings, because feelings would come later, and facts were what actually protected people. When Danielle finished, Renata was quiet for a moment before she spoke again, her tone shifting into something more careful, more deliberate. "There is something else you should know," she said, "something that changes the timeline we discussed at your grandmother's passing, something that puts you in a very different position than the one you have been living in for the past 6 years. Danielle's grandmother, Renata explained, had not simply left behind a modest trust fund the way Danielle had always believed, the version of the story Danielle had accepted without much curiosity, because grief tends to make people accept simple explanations over complicated ones. The truth was larger, and had been kept deliberately quiet at her grandmother's own request, structured through decades of careful, private acquisition until it became Ashgrove Holdings, a firm with controlling interests across commercial real estate, regional lending, and, as of 18 months ago, a minority but rapidly growing stake in several luxury real estate brokerages across the state, one of which happened to be Callaway Luxury Realty, acquired quietly during a period when the firm needed emergency capital, and nobody involved in the transaction bothered connecting the beneficiary's married name to the man who ran the company receiving the funds. Danielle sat perfectly still in the dark office, the phone pressed to her ear, and felt something shift inside her chest that was not quite shock and not quite relief but some third thing she did not yet have a word for. "You are saying," she said slowly, "that I already have a financial relationship with my husband's company." "You are saying," Renata corrected gently, "that you have significant influence over whether his company survives its current cash position, and that as of last quarter's disclosure requirements, which you have been ignoring for 2 years, you are legally required to formally acknowledge your beneficiary status before the board finalizes its upcoming restructuring vote." The restructuring vote, Renata continued, was scheduled to be formally announced at an industry event in 19 days. A gala hosted by a regional business alliance where several distressed firms, Callaway Luxury Realty prominently among them, would either receive emergency capital under new oversight or be quietly allowed to collapse under the weight of debts their leadership had spent years hiding behind good tailoring and louder confidence. Danielle asked the only question that mattered in that moment, the one she already suspected she knew the answer to. "Does Preston know any of this?" she asked, and Renata's answer came without hesitation. "Preston does not know your maiden name is attached to anything larger than a modest inheritance, because you have spent 6 years letting him believe that. And I have spent 6 years respecting your choice not to correct him." Danielle closed her eyes and pressed her palm flat against the cool surface of the desk. "Then let's keep it that way a little longer," she said, and for the first time since the wine had soaked through her dress that evening, something in her voice sounded less like exhaustion and more like a decision being made in real time. The following morning, Preston left for the office without mentioning the credit card again, the way he handled most uncomfortable subjects, by simply pretending enough time had passed that the conversation no longer existed. Danielle spent the day quietly documenting everything Renata had instructed her to preserve: screenshots of the fraud alert, the boutique receipt, a recorded voicemail Regina left later that afternoon suggesting Danielle should learn to take a joke and stop making the family look difficult in front of guests. Each piece saved to an encrypted folder Renata had set up for exactly this purpose months earlier, back when Danielle had insisted she would probably never need it. Danielle spent that same week continuing to move through the house as though nothing had changed, cooking dinner most nights, folding Preston's shirts the way she always had, not out of loyalty but because Renata had been clear that any sudden shift in her behavior might alert him before the record was complete, and Danielle had grown unexpectedly skilled at performing the exact version of calm domestic life he had always assumed was the entirety of who she was. There was a strange, quiet power in that performance, she realized one evening while ironing a shirt he would wear to impress people who were, unbeknownst to him, already reviewing his company's collapse in careful detail 2 floors above where he hoped to stand triumphant. She had spent 6 years being underestimated without choosing it. For the first time, she was choosing it deliberately, and the choosing made all the difference. By the end of that first week, 3 more unauthorized charges appeared on the fraudulent account: gifts, dinners, a weekend hotel booking under Simone's name at a boutique property 2 hours outside the city, each one a small stone added to a pile that was quickly becoming difficult to ignore, even for a man as skilled at ignoring things as Preston Callaway. Danielle said nothing to him about any of it, choosing instead to let the evidence accumulate quietly the way Renata had advised, because confrontation before the record was complete would only give Preston time to build a more convincing story before the truth caught up to him. In the middle of that first difficult week, Danielle drove 2 hours to see the one person outside of Renata's office who had never once needed convincing of her worth. Her older sister Monique, who ran a small bakery in the town they had both grown up in and had disliked Preston quietly and politely since the engagement dinner where he spent 40 minutes describing a golf course renovation to a room full of people who did not golf. Monique took one look at Danielle's face at the door and did not ask what happened. She simply put the kettle on and waited, because she had learned a long time ago that Danielle told the truth in her own time and never before. They sat at the small kitchen table in the back of the bakery long after closing, flour still dusting the counters, and Danielle finally told her everything. The wine, the video, the credit card, the trust she had never explained to anyone in the family she married into. Monique listened without interrupting, the way she always had since they were children. And when Danielle finished, she reached across the table and took her sister's hand. "I always knew you were more than what that family let you be," she said. "I just didn't know how much more. And honestly, I don't think I want to know the full number. I just want to know you're finally going to stop apologizing for taking up space." Danielle laughed for the first time in days, a real laugh, tired but genuine, and admitted the things she had not said out loud even to Renata, that some small, foolish part of her still wished none of this were necessary, that Preston had simply been the man she believed she married, and none of the trust or the credit card or the wine had ever needed to happen at all. Monique squeezed her hand once, firmly. "Wishing that is allowed," she said. "Grieving what you thought you had is allowed. But do not let that grief talk you into staying small, for people who never once made themselves smaller for you." Before Danielle left that night, Monique packed a box of the lemon cakes their grandmother used to make every spring, the recipe worn soft at the corners from years of handling, and told her sister to eat one every time she needed to remember who she had been before anyone tried to convince her she was only ever the quiet one, the sweet one, the woman who arranged flowers and stayed out of photographs. Danielle drove home with the box on the passenger seat and cried only once, briefly, at a red light 3 blocks from the house, before wiping her eyes, straightening her shoulders, and driving the rest of the way in the same steady quiet that had carried her through every difficult year of that marriage. 20 days before the gala, a second complication arrived, one that had nothing to do with Preston at all. Renata called Danielle on a Tuesday morning, with a tone Danielle had learned to recognize as the sound of a problem Renata had not yet fully solved. "There is a board member you need to know about before Friday's confirmation vote," Renata said. "His name is Desmond Whitlock. He has sat on the Ashgrove board for 11 years, and he has spent the last several days quietly asking whether a woman with, in his words, a documented public composure issue, should be confirmed as chairwoman during a period of active capital deployment." Danielle sat very still at her kitchen island, the same island where the credit card fraud alert had first appeared weeks earlier, and asked the obvious question: what documented composure issue? Renata's answer came evenly, the way she delivered every piece of bad news, without softening it and without letting it land harder than it needed to. "Someone forwarded the birthday party video to 3 board members over the weekend, framed as a concern rather than gossip, suggesting that a woman who could be publicly humiliated by her own husband without objecting might not project the kind of confidence Ashgrove wants representing its capital in front of lenders and press." Danielle understood immediately what was actually happening, because she had spent 4 years early in her career reading financial statements for men who lied about them for a living, and she recognized the particular shape of a manufactured objection long before Renata finished explaining it. This was never about composure. Desmond Whitlock did not care whether Danielle had cried at a birthday party. He cared about something else entirely, and the video was simply a convenient tool being used to delay a vote he needed delayed for reasons that had nothing to do with her at all. Renata's team spent the following 3 days quietly pulling Whitlock's financial disclosures, the kind of routine internal review that rarely turns up anything, and this time turned up everything. 18 months earlier, Desmond Whitlock had personally guaranteed a private bridge loan to a vendor supply company that held exclusive contracts with several regional luxury brokerages, Callaway Luxury Realty prominently among them, a related party arrangement he had never formally disclosed to the Ashgrove board, structured in a way that quietly benefited whenever a client firm like Preston's continued operating without outside oversight, rather than being restructured under new controls. In other words, Desmond Whitlock did not want Danielle confirmed as chairwoman because Danielle intended to bring exactly the kind of scrutiny to firms like Callaway Luxury Realty that would expose his own undisclosed financial relationship with the vendor supplying it. Delaying her confirmation using a humiliating video framed as a concern about composure was simply the fastest, cleanest way to buy himself time to unwind the arrangement quietly before anyone started asking harder questions. Danielle read the disclosure summary twice at her kitchen island, feeling something close to grim recognition rather than surprise, because she had learned a long time ago that men who wanted to slow a woman down rarely admitted the real reason, They simply reached for whatever humiliation was already sitting nearby and repurposed it. The wine down her dress had been meant to remind her of her place. Now the video of that same night was being repurposed by an entirely different man for an entirely different reason, and both of them had made the same mistake, assuming a woman's silence in the moment meant she would remain silent afterward as well. Renata scheduled an emergency session with the board's ethics committee 4 days before the gala, requesting that Whitlock's related party disclosure be reviewed alongside, not instead of, the confirmation vote he had tried to delay. Danielle did not attend the session herself. She did not need to. Renata presented the vendor loan documentation plainly, without editorializing, the same careful procedural tone Ashgrove used for everything, and within an hour the committee had voted unanimously to refer Whitlock's arrangement for formal review and to proceed with Danielle's confirmation as scheduled, the composure objection quietly withdrawn by the very board members who had raised it 2 days earlier, once they understood exactly whose composure the objection had actually been protecting. Danielle never mentioned the incident to Preston. There was no need. He remained, in the days that followed, entirely unaware that while he practiced his introduction for the summit in the bathroom mirror each night, a separate battle had already been fought and settled 2 floors above where he planned to stand, over a version of her he still did not know existed, by people whose names he had never once bothered to learn. 14 days before the gala, Preston came home late again, this time practically glowing, the particular glow of a man who believes he has just secured his own future. He found Danielle in the kitchen and, for once, actually looked at her while he spoke. "Big news," he said, tossing his keys into the glass bowl by the door with the confidence of a man returning to a kingdom he had built entirely by himself. Callaway Luxury got invited to present at the Regional Growth Summit. Capital partners, serious investors, exactly what the firm needs right now. Danielle kept her expression neutral, already knowing far more about that summit than he did. "And Simone will be there representing the firm alongside me," he added, watching her face for a reaction the way he always did lately, testing to see how far he could push before she finally broke. "After everything at my mother's party, I think it's better if you sit this one out. You'd probably be bored anyway." What he meant was clear enough without him saying it directly. You would not belong there. Danielle set down the dish towel she had been folding and looked at him for a long moment, long enough that his confident expression flickered slightly at the edges. "Then I hope the summit gives you exactly what you deserve," she said, and something about her calm delivery unsettled him more than an argument would have, though he covered it quickly with a short laugh and a comment about her being dramatic again, before heading upstairs to iron the suit he had already picked out for the evening. In the final week before the gala, Preston's confidence began to show small cracks he did not seem to notice himself. He came home twice that week later than usual, quieter than his glowing announcements had suggested he would be, and once Danielle found him standing in his study staring at a spreadsheet on his laptop, with an expression she had not seen on him since his father's funeral. When she asked if everything was fine with the firm, he closed the laptop too quickly and told her not to worry about things she wouldn't understand, a sentence that would have stung deeply 6 weeks earlier, and now simply confirmed what she already knew from the restructuring file sitting untouched in her own inbox. Regina called twice that week as well, not to apologize, but to remind Danielle in careful, clipped tones that appearances mattered enormously at an event like the summit, that Danielle should consider wearing something understated, so as not to distract from Preston's moment, and that perhaps, given everything, it might be simpler for everyone if Danielle did not attend at all and let Preston and Simone represent the firm together as originally planned. Danielle listened to the entire message without interrupting, the way she had learned to do, and did not call back. 3 nights before the gala, Danielle sat alone in the guest room she had begun sleeping in more nights than not, laying the ivory gown across the bed and looking at it for a long time before she ever tried it on. It was simple, deliberately so, the opposite of everything Regina and Simone valued in a dress. No sequins, no plunging neckline, nothing designed to be photographed from a particular angle. Renata had suggested the simplicity herself during their final preparation call. "Let the room do the noticing," she had said. "You don't need the dress to announce anything. The room will do that for you the moment you walk in." Danielle tried the dress on once, alone, standing in front of the mirror the way she had stood in the powder room the night of the wine. Except this time, her reflection looked different, not because anything about her face had changed, but because for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not bracing herself against a room before she had even entered it. She practiced nothing that night, no speech, no expression, because Renata had told her the truth mattered more than performance, and Danielle had spent 6 years performing calm for people who did not deserve to see the real thing. 2 days before the gala, a courier arrived at the house with 2 envelopes. The first was addressed to Danielle through Ashgrove family office, formal, cream-colored, heavier stock than any mail she typically received. The second, delivered separately an hour later, came from Preston's attorney's office, a firm Danielle recognized only because Regina had used them years earlier for a minor property dispute, thin, plain, and considerably less expensive-looking than the first. She opened Preston's envelope first, standing in the same kitchen where the wine stain still lingered faintly in her memory, though the dress itself had long since been thrown away. Inside were divorce papers, clean and clinical, a petition citing irreconcilable differences, a request that she vacate the house within 30 days, and an attached inventory of personal property he was willing to let her keep, her clothing, a modest jewelry collection, and, listed with almost comic specificity, her grandmother's thin gold ring, described in the document simply as costume jewelry of minimal value. Danielle read that particular line twice, something close to a laugh catching in her throat, before setting the papers aside and opening the second envelope, the cream-colored one, the one that mattered. Inside were her formal credentials for the Regional Growth Summit, a private entrance badge, a briefing card identifying her role, and a short handwritten note from a board liaison she had never met, informing her that executive reception would be prepared for her arrival and that the final restructuring packet would be available on a secure tablet at check-in. She folded the note carefully and slid it back into its envelope, then picked Preston's divorce papers back up, reading through them a second time with a strange, steady calm, because for the first time in 6 years, she understood something with total clarity, that the man who had just tried to tell her she could not afford to fight for this house had absolutely no idea what she could actually afford. And in 19 hours, standing on a stage he had not been invited to fully understand, he was finally going to find out. The evening of the gala arrived with a clear, cold sky, the kind of night that made the downtown skyline look sharper than usual against the dark. Preston arrived at the Sterling Grand Hotel with Simone on his arm, her dress a deep sapphire that caught the chandelier light with every step, Regina trailing slightly behind in pearls, already telling anyone who would listen that her son was finally about to be seen the way he deserved. Preston shook hands, laughed too loudly at small jokes from men he barely knew, and introduced Simone to potential investors as the driving force behind the firm's rebranding, never once using the word wife in any sentence that evening, letting the silence around that missing word do exactly the damage he did not realize it was doing. Danielle had spent the morning of the gala alone, deliberately, telling Renata she needed a few hours before check-in to sit with herself before the evening required anything of her at all. She drove out to the small cemetery where her grandmother was buried, a place she had not visited in nearly a year, and sat on the grass beside the modest headstone for the better part of an hour, telling her, out loud, everything that had happened since the wine, the credit card, Whitlock, Regina's cold warmth toward a woman who was not her own daughter-in-law. "I think you would have liked watching this play out," Danielle said finally, standing to brush the grass from her dress. "Though I also think you would have told me to stop wasting good outrage on people who were never going to deserve an explanation." She stopped by Monique's bakery on the way back into the city, not to talk, simply to sit at the same small table in the back for 20 minutes while her sister worked, the smell of butter and sugar doing more to settle her nerves than any rehearsed speech could have. Monique packed her a single lemon cake to eat before the gala began, insisting a woman should never walk into a room that intimidates her on an empty stomach, and Danielle ate it standing in the bakery's kitchen, laughing quietly at how ordinary the moment felt, directly before something that was about to feel anything but ordinary. 2 floors above the main ballroom, in a private reception suite, Danielle stood in a simple ivory gown, no jewelry beyond her grandmother's thin gold ring, now cleaned and catching the light exactly the way it needed to, and no more. A senior partner from Ashgrove, a calm gray-haired man named Walter Grimes, reviewed the final restructuring summary with her one last time, Callaway Luxury Realty listed plainly among several distressed firms under review. Vendor payments delayed for months, projected revenue overstated in at least one lender packet, Preston's signature attached to nearly every document detailing exactly how close to collapse the company he was currently celebrating had actually come. Walter Grimes found Danielle alone for a moment near the window of the reception suite, the ballroom faintly audible 2 floors below, and asked, in the careful, unhurried way he asked most things, whether she was ready. Danielle considered the question honestly before answering. "I have been ready longer than I realized," she said. "I just needed the room to finally be ready to see it." Walter nodded once, the closest thing to a smile he allowed himself before formal proceedings, and told her something she would remember long after that night ended. "The board did not choose you because you are Preston Calloway's wife, or even because you are your grandmother's granddaughter," he said. "We chose you because every disclosure you have ever filed, every quarter you were legally required to acknowledge, you filed honestly and on time, quietly, without ever once asking anything of us in return. That is a rarer quality in this industry than people outside it would ever guess." Desmond Whitlock did not attend the gala that evening. His seat on the board's welcome committee remained conspicuously empty, a small detail no one in the ballroom noticed except Danielle and Renata, who exchanged a brief, private glance across the room before the evening's program began, the kind of glance shared only by 2 people who understood exactly how close a very different kind of story had come to being told that night instead. At exactly 8 o'clock, the ballroom lights dimmed and the evening's host stepped onto the stage to introduce the summit's lead capital sponsor, Ashgrove Holdings, a private firm whose quiet influence had shaped regional commercial real estate for over 2 decades. Preston clapped along with the room, the name meaning prestige to him and nothing more. No danger, no recognition, no reason at all to feel the small chill that should have crossed his shoulders in that moment but did not, because he still believed, in the deepest, most comfortable part of himself, that the story of that evening belonged entirely to him. "It is my honor," the host continued, "to introduce tonight the incoming chairwoman and controlling beneficiary of the Ashgrove Family Trust, a name many of you have done business alongside for years, without ever once meeting the woman behind it, by her own careful, deliberate choice." The side doors opened. Danielle walked in, not through the main entrance where guests announced themselves with photographs and forced smiles, but through the private side hall reserved for people the room was actually built to serve, flanked by 2 Ashgrove executives who stepped slightly aside as she passed, the movement of heads across the ballroom following her like a wave finding its own natural direction. Preston stopped mid-sentence. Simone's hand loosened on his arm before she even understood why her body had reacted before her mind caught up. Regina went very still in her chair, pearls suddenly feeling too tight around her throat. Danielle did not look toward their table. That, more than anything else, was what made the moment unbearable for them. The fact that after everything, after the wine and the boutique receipts and the divorce papers describing her grandmother's ring as costume jewelry, she did not need to look at them at all anymore. As she crossed the ballroom floor, Danielle allowed herself one small private thought, that the last time this many people had watched her walk through a room, she had been holding a cake knife in a navy dress no one remembered the color of, and tonight she would not remember what a single guest at that table wore at all. Because for the first time in longer than she could measure, the room had finally organized itself around her rather than around the man beside her. She did not walk quickly. She did not walk slowly either. She simply walked the way a woman walks when she has stopped needing the room's permission to take up exactly the space she has always occupied. She climbed the short steps to the stage, accepted Walter Grimes's hand with quiet, practiced grace, and took the microphone while the room slowly rose to its feet around her. A standing ovation for a woman most of those executives had ignored all evening in favor of the man now sitting frozen at his table, watching his wife accept applause from people who had spent the last 2 hours pretending she did not exist. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Ashgrove believes capital should strengthen businesses that are honest about what they are building. Tonight is about accountability, not image." Preston's throat had gone completely dry. Beside him, Simone had already begun looking toward the nearest exit, some instinct in her recognizing the shape of consequence arriving before her mind could fully process it. Walter Grimes continued the formal presentation, outlining the review process for distressed regional firms in calm, procedural language that made everything sound worse, precisely because it sounded so unremarkable, so routine, so entirely without malice, which was in some ways crueler than anger could ever have been. Callaway Luxury Realty appeared on the screen briefly, listed among several companies flagged for structured oversight. And somewhere at that table, Regina made a small sound that might have been a gasp, or might simply have been the sound of a woman finally understanding exactly how much she had underestimated the daughter-in-law she had spent 6 years calling difficult. After the formal presentation ended, a member of Ashgrove's staff approached Preston's table quietly, without spectacle, and asked him to join legal counsel in the executive conference room upstairs. Your attorney is welcome to attend if you have retained one for this matter. Preston stood on legs that did not feel entirely his own, glancing once toward the stage where Danielle now stood speaking calmly with 2 board members, not looking at him, not needing to look at him, her composure the loudest thing in the entire room. In the conference room upstairs, the air felt sharper somehow, cleaner, the kind of quiet that comes before something important rather than after it. Preston sat across from Renata Cole, Regina rigid beside him, Simone hovering near the door with an envelope she had just been formally served, her sapphire dress suddenly looking less like triumph and more like a costume she had worn to the wrong occasion entirely. Danielle stood at the far end of the room, composed, unhurried, no longer a woman who needed anyone in that space to grant her permission to exist fully. So this was a setup, Preston finally managed, his voice smaller than Danielle had heard it in years. No, she said simply. This was an event your company already needed to attend. You chose who to bring. Renata slid the first packet of documents across the table, acknowledgement of the divorce petition, formal notice of disputed credit activity opened fraudulently under Danielle's identity, and preservation requests for all financial and electronic records tied to both the household and the firm. Preston stared down at the phrase disputed credit activity for a long moment before looking up sharply at Simone, who had gone pale near the door, clutching her own envelope now like something that might combust. He told me it was a company card, Simone said quietly, her voice cracking slightly under the weight of a room that had suddenly stopped protecting her. Preston snapped at her to stop talking, but the words were already out, already true. Already exactly the kind of small honest slip that happens when fear finally outweighs loyalty. Renata made a brief, unhurried note without changing her expression at all. The practiced calm of a woman who had watched this exact unraveling happen many times before and knew better than to rush it. In the executive conference room, before anyone rose to leave, Renata walked through the preservation notices one final time, methodical and unhurried, explaining that a formal deposition would be scheduled within 30 days regarding the disputed credit account, that Preston and Simone would each be required to answer questions under oath about the device logs already tied to the fraudulent application, and that any inconsistency between their statements and the preserved records would be treated by the court exactly as inconsistencies are always treated, as evidence in their own right. Preston asked, quietly now, all the earlier bravado gone, whether he needed to hire additional counsel beyond the attorney his mother had recommended. Renata did not answer that question for him. That, she said simply, is a decision only you can make, though I would encourage you to make it carefully. The deposition took place 3 weeks later in a conference room considerably less grand than the one at the Sterling Grand. Fluorescent lighting instead of chandeliers, a court reporter typing quietly in the corner, while Preston answered questions about a credit application he insisted, under oath, he believed had been a standard company account. An answer that unraveled within minutes once opposing counsel produced the original application, submitted from a personal device registered to Preston, using Danielle's social security number entered manually rather than auto-filled, a detail that made the claim of an honest mistake considerably harder to sustain. Simone's own deposition, held the following week, lasted less than 40 minutes, most of it spent confirming, with visible discomfort, that she had known the boutique purchase and the hotel booking were charged to an account that was not, in fact, a company card, regardless of what she had been told to believe at the time. The following morning, Callaway Luxury Realty placed Preston on administrative leave pending internal review, the announcement carefully worded to mention lender concerns and cooperation with capital partners. Nothing about wine stains or fraudulent credit cards or a wife nobody at that firm had bothered getting to know. Within 2 days, Ashgrove required the company to submit a full accounting of vendor payments, marketing expenditures, and any credit applications tied to household or business operations over the preceding year. a request that made several of Preston's own senior staff stop returning his calls almost immediately. Because uncertainty is contagious in a way that scandal rarely manages to be. 3 weeks after the gala, Renata's investigators uncovered one final detail neither of them had expected, tucked inside the same financial disclosures pulled during Preston's administrative review. Regina Calloway had personally co-signed a private loan against the family estate 2 years earlier, quietly, without informing Preston, in order to cover a shortfall in the firm's marketing budget during a quarter Preston had publicly described to investors as the company's strongest yet. Regina had spent 2 years managing that debt in silence, terrified of what it would mean for her own reputation if anyone learned the family's finances were never as solid as the birthday parties and the tailored suits suggested. When Renata's office formally notified Regina that the loan would need to be disclosed as part of the firm's restructuring review, Regina called Danielle for the first time using her own name instead of a voicemail. Her voice on the phone was smaller than Danielle had ever heard it, all its usual polish worn away. "I did what I thought I had to do to protect this family," Regina said. And Danielle, who had spent 6 years being told by this same woman that she did not understand what it meant to protect a family, found she had very little left to say in response beyond the truth. "Protecting a family and protecting an image were never the same thing," Danielle said gently, "and I think somewhere along the way you stopped being able to tell them apart." Regina did not defend herself further. The loan was disclosed, absorbed into the broader restructuring plan Ashgrove had already begun implementing, and Regina's role in the family business, largely ceremonial for years despite how she carried herself, quietly ended altogether. She sold a portion of her jewelry collection within the month, not out of necessity, Danielle later learned, but out of something that looked, for the first time in years, like genuine humility. Regina called Danielle 6 times over the following week. Danielle answered none of them. On the 7th attempt, Regina left a voicemail, her voice thinner than Danielle had ever heard it, admitting that perhaps things had been said in the heat of a difficult evening, suggesting they speak as family once emotions settled. Danielle saved the voicemail, forwarded it to Renata's office along with everything else, and did not respond, not out of cruelty, but because some doors are worth leaving closed on purpose, as a boundary rather than as a punishment. In the weeks that followed, Simone's unraveling happened publicly in the small, particular way that only exists within a tight regional industry, where everyone knows everyone, and reputations move faster than facts ever do. 2 firms that had already extended informal offers quietly withdrew them within days of the gala, citing nothing specific, which in that industry was its own kind of answer. A former colleague texted Simone a single link to a local business journal article about the restructuring review, no message attached, and Simone understood exactly what the silence around it meant. She reached out to Danielle once, nearly a month after the gala, a short message sent late at night that read simply, "I didn't know about the card. I want you to know that much at least." Danielle read the message twice, considered several responses, and ultimately sent none at all, not out of cruelty, but because some conversations exist only to make the sender feel better, and Danielle had spent enough years managing other people's comfort at the expense of her own. Simone disappeared from the regional real estate circuit within a matter of weeks, quietly, the way people disappear when the rooms that once welcomed them start finding reasons not to. Preston came to Renata's office 3 days after the gala, waiting outside in a wrinkled suit, his tie loosened, asking simply to talk. Danielle allowed herself that much, standing in the hallway while he tried to explain that he had not known about Ashgrove, about the trust, about any of it. If she had only told him, none of this would have happened. "If I had told you I was capable of any of this," she answered quietly, "you would have treated me the way you treated Simone, and that is precisely why I never told you." Preston's life over those months narrowed in ways he clearly had not anticipated. The administrative leave that had begun as a quiet, procedural inconvenience stretched into a formal separation from the firm once the deposition record became part of the broader review, and the confident, easy charm that had once carried him through boardrooms and birthday parties alike found considerably less traction with lenders who had already read the transcripts. He took a smaller role at a regional brokerage 2 counties over by the following spring, a job he would once have considered beneath him, and told the few former colleagues who still returned his calls that he was simply taking time to focus on what mattered, a phrase that had once meant nothing to him and now, Danielle suspected, might finally be starting to. He reached out to her twice more after the meeting outside Renata's office, both times by text rather than in person. Once to ask whether she had really meant what she said about never telling him the truth, and once, months later, simply to say he hoped she was well, no request attached, no attempt to reopen anything. Danielle read both messages, considered them honestly, and replied to neither, not because she wished him harm, but because she had finally learned the difference between forgiveness and access, and she no longer felt obligated to offer both to everyone who asked for one. The divorce proceeded through counsel over the following months. The prenuptial terms Preston had once signed, without reading holding firmer than he expected. The disputed credit accounts fully documented and resolved in Danielle's favor through bank records and device logs Renata's team had preserved, with exact, patient care. Callaway Luxury Realty survived under new oversight and reduced leadership authority for Preston, who eventually stepped back from daily operations entirely once lenders made it clear that trust, at this point, had become considerably more valuable to the firm than his last name. Danielle kept the house for exactly as long as it took to sell it on her own terms, walking through the empty rooms one final quiet afternoon, running her palm along the kitchen counter, where a ruined ivory dress had once dripped wine onto tile Preston had insisted photographed well for listings he never actually needed. The rooms no longer frightened her, which was how she finally understood she was ready to let them go completely. She moved into a smaller home with better light, closer to the small financial recovery nonprofit she quietly began funding through Ashgrove for women rebuilding their lives after controlling marriages. No press attention, no public campaign about her own story, just legal support, credit counseling, and a private, practical path forward for people who needed one before they had the strength to ask for it out loud. On her birthday that year, she wore navy again, not out of superstition but simply because she liked the color, and cut her own cake at a small table surrounded by people who had never once needed her to prove she belonged in the room. Monique drove down for the birthday party that year, bringing a box of the same lemon cakes their grandmother used to make every spring, and the two sisters spent the afternoon in Danielle's new kitchen with better light, laughing about nothing important. The way people laugh when nothing important is exactly the point. Renata stopped by for an hour, no longer simply an attorney by that point, but something closer to family, the kind earned through difficult years rather than assigned by a marriage certificate. Danielle's father sat near the window with a cup of tea, watching his daughter move easily through her own home, and told her quietly, before he left that evening, that she reminded him more of her grandmother now than she ever had before, which Danielle understood to be the highest compliment either of them knew how to give. A year after the gala, Ashgrove's board formally confirmed the recovery nonprofit Danielle had started as a permanent division of the family office, no longer a quiet side project funded out of her own discretionary account, but a fully staffed program with its own budget, its own case managers, and its own waiting list of women who had heard about it through word of mouth rather than advertising, because Danielle had insisted from the beginning that the program never carry her name or her story publicly. It existed to help people rebuild, not to remind anyone of what she had survived to build it. Sometimes, in the quiet hours after the nonprofit's case managers went home for the evening, Danielle thought about the version of that birthday party that might have happened if Preston had simply set the wine glass down instead of tipping it a second time, if Regina had offered her the same warmth she offered Simone, if none of it had ever forced her to finally stop shrinking herself to fit a marriage that had never once made room for her. She did not spend long on those thoughts. They were not useful, and she had learned, slowly and at real cost, that dwelling on the version of a life that never happened was its own quiet way of staying small. What she thought about instead, more often, was the particular sound the ballroom had made the night the host said her name, not applause exactly, something closer to a held breath finally released. 200 people realizing all at once how completely they had misjudged the woman standing at the edge of every photograph for 6 years, without ever once being asked to step into the center of one. She had not needed that sound to know her own worth, but she would be lying, she sometimes admitted to Monique over lemon cake, if she said it had not felt good to finally hear it out loud. The gold ring stayed on her hand, the same one Preston's own attorney had once described as costume jewelry of minimal value in a document he had drafted without ever once looking closely enough to understand what he was actually looking at. She never needed him to see its worth. She had simply, finally, stopped waiting for him to. If Danielle's story reminded you that the quietest person in the room is often the one holding all the power, that is exactly the kind of story we tell here. So hit that like button before you go, and let us know you felt it too. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you, and if you want to be sitting right here the next time someone underestimated finally gets to watch the room stand up for her, hit subscribe now, because the vault is never really closed.